It starts, like so many stories in organized crime, with a man nobody took seriously. Not a feared hitman, not a legendary bank robber, just a polite, well-spoken fraudster with nice manners and a talent for pretending to be someone he wasn't. His name was Christopher Vincent Kinahan, and before long he would be running one of the most powerful drug cartels Ireland had ever seen. Imagine Dublin in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Unemployment is high, emigration is ripping families apart, political violence is never too far away, and in certain parts of the city, a new plague is taking over: heroin. Housing estates that once echoed with kids playing football now echo with the sound of deals being done in alleyways, needles in stairwells, young people wasting away on street corners, parents watching helplessly as one child after another is pulled into addiction. At the centre of that crisis was a name everyone in Dublin knew: Larry Dunn. Dunn didn't grow up in comfort. He was one of 14 kids raised in poverty, with a father who spent time in prison for manslaughter. Several of the children ended up in trouble with the law. That kind of background often produces one of two things: a survivor or a predator. Dunn was both. In the 1970s, he found a way to make money that outstripped anything robbery or burglary could offer. He became the city's main heroin importer. Working with criminals in Britain, he flooded Dublin with the drug, building a fortune on the back of other people's ruin. By 1982, despite having no official job, he'd bought a luxury home worth what would be well over €1 million today. Everybody knew it wasn't bought with honest wages, but for a while, nobody could touch him. The government's response to the heroin wave was slow, stiff, and deeply out of touch. A special task force on drug abuse was set up in 1983, and experts warned about the social and economic realities driving addiction, but their report was buried. The official line was simple: if you were on drugs, it was your own fault. End of story. Instead of treatment, tougher laws came. The Misuse of Drugs Acts, which tended to punish addicts more than dismantle the cartels supplying them. So the communities hit hardest did something drastic. They took matters into their own hands. In working-class estates across Dublin, residents formed committees and patrols. Priests spoke from the pulpit. Activists and even members of the Provisional IRA joined residents' associations. They started naming and shaming local dealers. They knocked on doors, delivered ultimatums: stop selling or get out. Some went further: unofficial checkpoints, forced evictions, punishment beatings, cars searched by locals, not by police. It was rough justice, and it was far from perfect, but it showed just how badly people felt abandoned by the state. Under growing pressure from both communities and media, Gardaí finally managed to build a case against Larry Dunn. In 1983, he was arrested and later convicted of serious drug offences. For the first time, the city's main supplier was behind bars. In court, before he was sentenced, he reportedly gave one last warning to the authorities: if you think I'm bad, you should see what's coming behind me. At the time, it sounded like a bitter boast from a man whose empire had just fallen, but it would turn out to be chillingly accurate. Because when Dunn went to prison, the heroin didn't disappear, the addicts didn't vanish, the dealing didn't stop. On the streets, officers like Michael O'Sullivan and his colleagues could see it clearly. The same corners, the same flats, the same constant flow of drugs. The face at the top had changed, but the pipeline was still wide open. So they started asking a new question: if Dunn isn't running this anymore, who is? When the answer came back, it surprised nearly everyone: Christopher Kinahan. They already knew his name, just not in that context. Up to that point, his record looked small time: check fraud, theft, handling stolen goods, burglary. In the underworld, he was known as a kite man, someone who flies bad checks from shop to shop, cashing them before the bank realizes they're worthless. He was a scammer, not a feared drug lord. a man who used a posh accent and tidy clothes to pass as a respectable Irish gentleman or even an Englishman when it suited him. Former Assistant Commissioner O'Sullivan later described him as inconsequential in those early years, the sort of petty crook who barely ranked on the priority list. But even then, he wasn't like the others. He didn't swagger, he didn't try to intimidate, he thought, he watched, and above all, he followed the money. While most small-time criminals were scraping by on robbery and cheap scams, Kinahan was quietly looking for a way into something bigger, something that promised huge profit with as little personal risk as possible. In Dublin in the mid-1980s, that meant one thing: stepping into the vacuum left by Larry Dunn. When Gardaí started really scrutinizing his life, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. Dublin was suffering high unemployment, mass emigration, economic stagnation. But Christopher Kinahan was living in a luxury flat in one of the city's wealthier areas. He drove a red sports car. He mingled easily, dressed well, and spoke like someone from a better background than most of the people he was quietly supplying. There was no legitimate business on record that could explain his lifestyle, no obvious job, no declared income, and yet everything about him said money. Then came 1986, the year that finally exposed who he really was. Gardaí launched a covert operation targeting the apartment complex where he lived. Officers went undercover as handymen and maintenance workers, blending into the background, watching comings and goings, and quietly figuring out which exact flat belonged to him. When they were sure, a team moved in. Several officers, including Michael O'Sullivan, went to his door. An Algerian man opened it. The Gardaí identified themselves and entered. Inside the kitchen, they found a domestic scene that, at first glance, seemed almost ordinary. Kinahan himself was sitting at the table, eating lunch. What wasn't ordinary was the other table in the room. On it were stacks of heroin laid out in plain sight. Not a few wraps hidden in a drawer. Not a stash for personal use. A serious haul, later valued at roughly $117,000, an enormous amount for the time. O'Sullivan would later recall the moment, how Kinahan looked up mid-bite, saw the officers, and visibly paled. The calm, well-spoken fraudster was caught standing over something far more serious than forged checks. The Algerian man, himself a known international trafficker, was arrested. So was Kinahan. For Gardaí, this was the missing piece. This wasn't a chancer selling a few bags on the side. This was someone sitting at the director level of a major supply line. In court, Kinahan tried to fall back on a familiar tactic. He pleaded guilty, but claimed he was just a heroin addict trying to get his life together. The volume of drugs seized told a different story. This was wholesale product, not a personal stash. The judge saw through the act. Kinahan was sentenced to 6 years in Mountjoy prison. On paper, that should have been the end. A clever but greedy fraudster overstepped, got caught, and went away. Case closed. But Mountjoy didn't close his story. It opened a new chapter, because men like Christopher Kinahan don't see prison the way most people do. They don't see a dead end. They see a networking opportunity. And behind those walls, he was about to build the connections that would transform him from a mid-level player into the mastermind of an international crime empire. When most people go to prison, everything stops. Career, relationships, money, life freezes. But when criminals go to prison, something entirely different happens. Networks grow, favors are traded, alliances are born. Behind locked doors, the most dangerous classrooms in the world operate every day, and the men inside learn lessons no college professor could ever teach. And prison was exactly where Christopher Kinahan finally became the thing he had always wanted to be. Not just a criminal with connections. Inside Mountjoy, Kinahan met men who didn't just sell drugs on a street corner, they imported them. He met international traffickers, armed robbers, money launderers, and fugitives who needed people like him, smart men with no addiction, no impulsiveness, and no fear of moving across borders. Kinahan wasn't a violent thug, and he wasn't charismatic in the Hollywood sense, but prison officers who worked around him during that sentence described something else, someone calm, tidy, quiet, and always listening. Instead of doing time, he was building a future. When he finally walked out in 1992, the expectation was that he'd disappear, maybe return to petty crime or simply fade away. But Kinahan barely lasted a year before Garda E were knocking again, this time over stolen checks. But something was different. The punishment that followed wasn't what changed his future, the timing did. Because just as Kinahan was being arrested again, Ireland was about to enter one of the most violent chapters in its criminal history. In 1996, journalist Veronica Guerin was murdered by a crime gang she had been investigating. She was shot at a traffic light. Ireland exploded in outrage. Newspapers ran front-page photos of her lifeless body. Politicians faced a national humiliation. A journalist executed in broad daylight because she told the truth. Suddenly, drug lords weren't just criminals, they were public enemies. Within a week, everything changed. New laws, new policing powers, a new agency, the Criminal Assets Bureau, designed specifically to destroy criminal wealth and seize everything criminals owned, from cars to mansions. This wasn't just get arrested and go to court. This was lose everything, forever. And Kinahan knew exactly what that meant. He didn't wait around to find out how bad the crackdown would get. He ran, first to the UK, then to Amsterdam. Not because he was afraid of prison, but because he saw something the Irish police didn't. International drugs were about to explode, and Amsterdam was the future. In the drug world, Amsterdam wasn't just a city, it was the Wall Street of narcotics. From Turkish heroin suppliers to Dutch chemists manufacturing ecstasy, Amsterdam became the central trading floor of Europe. If you wanted to grow beyond one city, if you wanted to become global, you went to the Netherlands. Kinahan didn't just go, he planted himself deep in its underworld. Over there, he reconnected with someone he had met years earlier, John Cunningham, a dangerous Irish criminal who had kidnapped a young woman and fled the country. Cunningham was a fugitive, hiding from Irish authorities. Kinahan introduced him to Amsterdam's booming ecstasy market. Together, the two men started forming relationships that would carry them into the modern era of organized crime. But no rise goes unnoticed, and in the late 1990s, Kinahan drew attention for cashing more stolen travelers' checks, over $16,000 worth. That mistake dragged him back into Irish hands. When he returned for his father's funeral, Garda E arrested him again. One officer, Michael O'Sullivan, remembered questioning him. Kinahan silent the whole time, accepting to deliver one chilling sentence. "You think you're so smart? I followed you." He wasn't bragging. O'Sullivan actually remembered spotting Kinahan trailing him years earlier. Same car, same license plate. The arrogance was gone. What was left was calculation. Observation. Patience. Once again, Kinahan was refused bail. Once again, he went to prison. But this time, it didn't weaken him. It made him stronger. Inside, something unusual happened. He studied hard. He didn't spend his time running schemes. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't act like a gangster. He earned 2 degrees, one in Russian and one in Spanish. Imagine what that means for an international drug trafficker. Suddenly, the whole world became open to him. South America, Spain, Eastern Europe. Languages weren't just education, they were future deals. And when offered early release, he said no. He wanted to finish his studies first. That decision alone reveals everything about him. He wasn't impulsive, he wasn't emotional, he was methodical. When Kinahan walked out of prison in 2001, nobody realized what had just happened. They thought a small-time Dublin criminal had served his sentence and walked free. But in reality, Ireland's most powerful criminal mastermind had just graduated from the deadliest university on earth, and his next move would take him somewhere nobody expected: the warm beaches of Spain, where Irish gangsters settled, trafficked, networked, and eventually went to war. Because the Kinahan Empire didn't truly begin in Dublin. It began on the Costa del Crime. Spain's Costa del Sol is known today for beaches and tourists. But during the early 2000s, criminals knew it by another name: Costa del Crime. Why? Because it was the perfect place for wanted men to disappear. British drug lords, ex-IRA members, Russian mobsters, fugitives and international traffickers fled there to escape arrests, extradition and police pressure in their home countries. The climate was beautiful, the lifestyle luxurious, and most importantly, local authorities weren't aggressively hunting them. For a man like Christopher Kinahan, it was paradise. When he arrived, Spain had no extradition treaty with Ireland. That alone meant he could operate freely. Add to that the fact that Morocco was only a short distance away, a place known as one of the world's biggest cannabis-producing regions, and you begin to understand why Costa del Sol became a criminal capital. Kinahan didn't just hide, he expanded. In Ireland, he was a major player, but in Spain, he began to move like an international businessman. He started forming partnerships with traffickers who could supply cocaine, heroin, ecstasy, and cannabis, all at wholesale levels. This was no longer check fraud, this was global commerce. And another thing was happening during those years: the cocaine boom. In the 1980s, heroin destroyed Dublin. In the 1990s, ecstasy flooded Europe's club culture, but by the early 2000s, cocaine became the fashionable drug of choice. While other criminals were fighting over leftover street-level heroin markets, Kinahan was already working on what would be next. This ability to see the future before the future arrived is what separated him from every other Irish gangster of that generation. He wasn't reacting, he was planning. But while Kinahan was becoming a global trafficker in Spain, his children back home were being groomed for something big. His sons, Daniel and Christopher Jr., were growing up, raised mostly without their father, who spent half their childhood in prison. The boys were being shaped by Dublin's criminal world. By the late 1990s, both sons were already involved in managing distribution operations back in Ireland, handling ecstasy importation and street-level suppliers. Daniel, born in 1977, became known for his charisma, aggression and leadership. Christopher Jr., born in 1980, focused more on organization and logistics. While their father built the supply chain, the sons built the distribution network. This was no longer one criminal, this was a crime family. But Spain also brought them into contact with other rising Irish criminals. One name in particular would shape everything that was coming: Gary Hutch. At first, Hutch was an ally, a loyal associate of the Kinahans, someone they trusted, someone they worked with, someone who stood beside them as Dublin's criminal landscape shifted. But loyalty in organized crime is a fragile thing, and trust is often temporary. Sooner or later, alliances crack. The relationship between the Hutch family and the Kinahans began friendly, almost natural. Both families operated out of Dublin. Both had international ambitions. Both were expanding beyond traditional street-level crime. But underneath every partnership, a hidden rivalry simmered. Because in the underworld, there is only one rule that matters: there can only be one king. As Kinahan enjoyed luxury living in Marbella, his empire quietly stretched across Europe. Cocaine shipments began arriving through Spain. Money laundering networks expanded. Logistics became professional. His organization grew more ruthless and more sophisticated. Meanwhile, Daniel and his crew in Ireland began developing a reputation for violence far beyond the old-school crime families. The days of polite fraud and strategic deals were ending. The new generation were armed, impatient, and ready to remove anyone standing in their way. Names that would later appear in murder investigations, Liam Byrne, Freddie Thompson, the Byrne brothers, were becoming loyal soldiers under Daniel's command. Kinahan Sr. wasn't just a criminal anymore, he was now a crime boss. One thing became clear: Dublin was too small for what the Kinahans were becoming. They were no longer Irish criminals. They were European traffickers exporting cocaine, heroin, cannabis, and weapons. Their influence spread from Amsterdam to Spain, from Dublin to London, and eventually into the Middle East. And one day, while law enforcement believed they were chasing a missing Czech fraudster, the Kinahans suddenly revealed themselves as one of the largest drug suppliers in all of Western Europe. But that rise didn't happen quietly, because while the Kinahans were expanding, a feud was beginning to boil. A feud that would turn into one of the bloodiest gang wars in modern Irish history. What started with alliances would end in murder. And that story begins when Daniel Kinahan decides that loyalty is optional, but revenge is mandatory. By the late 2000s, the Kinahan Crime Group was quietly becoming one of Europe's largest drug trafficking networks. Money flowed through Spain, product came through Morocco and South America, and loyal soldiers in Dublin handled street distribution. Everything looked stable until trust inside the organization began to collapse. And the man standing in the middle of that collapse was Gary Hutch. Gary Hutch wasn't a newcomer. He had been part of the Kinahan inner circle, someone Daniel trusted, someone who handled operations in Spain, and someone who understood both sides of the criminal partnership. He was close enough to be protected and dangerous enough to matter, but he wasn't family. And in organized crime, that difference eventually becomes deadly. Then came February 2008. Gary Hutch, Daniel Kinahan, and another dangerous figure, Paddy Doyle, were involved in an incident that changed everything. Doyle, a volatile and unpredictable hitman, had become a liability. He started arguments, made threats, and caused problem after problem with foreign gangsters. One afternoon, Hutch and Doyle were traveling together when gunmen opened fire on their car. Hutch and Daniel's associate survived, but Paddy Doyle ran, was shot, and died at the scene. The official story was that Russian Mafia were responsible. Newspapers printed the story. Law enforcement believed it. But many seasoned crime reporters reached a very different conclusion. Doyle wasn't killed by Russians. He was killed by the Kinahans. And Hutch, the man who was in the car with him, was suspected of helping set him up. After that shooting, Spanish authorities realized that Irish gangsters weren't just hiding in their country. They were murdering each other on Spanish soil. Tourists were frightened, media attention grew, and Spain couldn't pretend nothing was happening anymore. Suddenly, Daniel, Christopher, and their father drew police attention like never before. And in 2010, Spain launched Operation Shovel, one of the largest anti-mafia operations in its history. Multiple countries worked together: Ireland, Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands. They raided homes, seized documents, arrested accountants, lawyers, and cartel-connected professionals. In luxury homes across Marbella, police believed they finally had enough evidence to end the Irish Mafia once and for all. They arrested more than 30 people, including Christopher Kinahan and both sons. It looked like the end. Newspapers celebrated. Politicians congratulated themselves. Irish law enforcement thought they'd finally cut the head off the snake. But then, something happened that almost nobody expected. Within 3 years, the case collapsed. The Kinahans were released. The evidence didn't hold. Daniel and his father walked out of prison and went straight back to their lives on the Costa del Sol, like nothing had ever happened. The Spanish world of organized crime had just learned a terrifying truth. You can arrest the Kinahans, but you can't stop them. Meanwhile, another part of Daniel's life was becoming increasingly public: professional boxing. Around 2012, Daniel co-founded MTK Global, a management and promotion company that quickly signed major names: boxing champions, UFC fighters, well-known Irish athletes. Within a few years, MTK became a recognizable brand across the world of combat sports. Yet behind the scenes, investigators claimed that Daniel was still involved, despite public statements that he had stepped away. His business image was polished, international, respected, but his criminal identity remained violent, paranoid, unforgiving. Then came something nobody expected. Daniel's personal life took a devastating turn. His mother, June, died. June had raised the two boys almost entirely alone in the Oliver Bond flats in Dublin, a neighbourhood destroyed by heroin addiction when they were growing up. She'd worked with addiction charities, begging the city to help families trapped in the crisis. But instead of building a better future, her sons entered the very world she fought against. Her funeral brought reporters, investigators, and even rival criminals, hoping to catch a glimpse of what the next move would be. And during that funeral, graffiti appeared outside a nearby church. It said, "Gary Hutch, you rat." At that moment it became clear. The alliance was broken. Gary Hutch wasn't an associate anymore. He was marked, and as every gangster in Spain and Ireland already knew, a Kinahan never forgives a betrayal. The betrayal that began with suspicion in 2008 was about to ignite a war that would leave bodies across Ireland, Spain and beyond. A war that would become the bloodiest gang feud in modern Irish history, and it would begin with a gunman waiting in the bushes, holding a weapon he thought would kill Daniel Kinahan, but he shot the wrong man. And from that mistake, a massacre would begin that would shake Ireland to its core. By 2014, tensions between Daniel Kinahan and Gary Hutch were no longer quiet. Whatever once held them together, business, loyalty, trust, had dissolved. The friendship was now poisoned by suspicion. Then something happened that turned suspicion into war. Late one night in Marbella, Daniel and several friends were at Daniel's villa. Among them was a professional boxer, Jamie Moore, a respected athlete, not a criminal, just a guest. Suddenly, from the darkness beside the house, shots were fired. Jamie Moore was hit multiple times. He collapsed, bleeding heavily. He lived, but someone else was supposed to die. That night, investigators now believe that the shooter thought he was shooting Daniel, that the gunman was waiting, hidden behind bushes, watching the wrong person leave the villa. The bullet wasn't meant for Moore, it was meant for a Kinahan. This wasn't business anymore, this was personal. Immediately, suspicion turned toward only one man, Gary Hutch, and Daniel didn't forget. But then something strange happened. Instead of retaliation, Hutch reached out to Daniel's uncle, the well-known Dublin crime figure Jerry the Monk Hutch, and begged for a meeting. Through intermediaries, they somehow managed to sit down and talk. Hutch didn't deny involvement. He simply agreed to pay compensation for the shooting, $200,000 in cash handed to Daniel. In the underworld, money can end a fight. But this wasn't business anymore. Something deeper was happening. Daniel Kinahan accepted the money, but acceptance is not forgiveness. Inside Daniel's mind, the vote had already been decided. Hutch had attacked him. Hutch had broken loyalty. Hutch had crossed a line Daniel believed could only be answered with blood. Then came an even darker demand. Daniel wanted retribution, but not against Gary alone. He wanted a blood sacrifice from Gary's family. He demanded that Patrick Hutch, Gary's brother, turn himself in and accept being shot in the legs, just like Jamie Moore. A horrifying idea. But even more horrifying was that the Hutch family agreed. They delivered Patrick for punishment. He was shot in the legs. It should have ended there. Violence answered with violence. Punishment balanced. Debt paid. But it didn't end. Because Daniel didn't want compensation. He wanted revenge. It began quietly. On September 24, 2015, Gary Hutch was leaving his apartment in Marbella. A masked gunman chased him down. Hutch ran desperately, screaming for help, pleading for his life. He was shot 3 times and died on the ground outside his home. Witnesses later reported hearing him shout to his killer, "Please don't, I did nothing." The gunman didn't respond. He just finished the job. Authorities concluded what everyone already knew. This was a Kinahan hit. It didn't stop there. 2 weeks later, Gary's brother Derek was stabbed in prison. He survived, but only barely. Soon after, Jerry Hutch himself was targeted. While on holiday, 2 gunmen entered a bar looking for him. Jerry escaped by pure luck. He later said the female friend who asked where they were going had set him up. Daniel wasn't done. The Hutch family had embarrassed him. They had tried to kill him. They had betrayed him. To Daniel, betrayal required a message, and that message would soon be written in blood on the streets of Dublin. The Kinahan organization was ready to launch a war unlike anything Ireland had ever seen. Mobsters began choosing sides. Weapons were being moved into the country. Cars were stolen. Safe houses prepared. This wouldn't be one assassination. This would be an ongoing execution list. The Kinahan Cartel didn't just want revenge, they wanted annihilation. And on February 5, 2016, they would try to wipe out the Hutch leadership in one single attack during a public event in front of cameras, journalists and athletes. A shooting so shocking it would become the most infamous gang ambush in Irish criminal history. By early 2016, Dublin police already sensed something catastrophic was coming. Intelligence warned of retaliation, weapons shipments, suspicious activity, and whispers that the Kinahans planned a public execution. But nobody imagined what would happen next. Because the Kinahan-Hutch feud didn't explode in a dark alley or in a quiet side street, it erupted in the middle of a hotel ballroom during a boxing weigh-in, surrounded by cameras, families, journalists, and the Irish sporting world. This wasn't crime. This was war. The Regency Hotel, February 5th, 2016, Whitehall, Dublin. Inside the Regency Hotel, the World Boxing Organization was hosting a weigh-in. Boxers, trainers, media crews, fans, everyone was there. One of the fighters was connected to Daniel's company MTK Global. Daniel Kinahan had originally planned to attend. His name was on the guest list. People expected to see him, but at the last minute, he wasn't there. Nobody knew why. Nobody imagined how important that would be. The moment everything changed. Around 2:30 p.m., sudden banging noises echoed through the room. At first, everyone assumed it was part of the event or equipment falling. Then panic hit, because those sounds were gunshots. Multiple men stormed into the hotel. 2 dressed like Garda armed response officers, carrying AK-47 rifles, others in ballistic vests, one disguised as a woman wearing a wig and long coat. They entered fast, firing shots and shouting orders. Guests ran, dove behind chairs, crawled under tables. Parents grabbed their children. Journalists dropped cameras and fled. In seconds, the room transformed from a sports event into a battlefield. The target investigators later believed that their goal wasn't random violence, it was assassination. They wanted Daniel Kinahan. But Daniel wasn't there, someone else was. A Kinahan enforcer named David Byrne, part of the Byrne Organized Crime Group. Before he understood what was happening, gunmen surrounded him and opened fire. He died instantly. 2 others were wounded. But Byrne was the message. This wasn't symbolic. This wasn't intimidation. This was a declaration of war. The gunmen vanish. Seconds after the shooting, the attackers fled the hotel, escaped in a Ford Transit van, and burned it shortly afterward to destroy forensic evidence. They disappeared. No fingerprints, no trace. The country was stunned. Not just the underworld, everyone. Ireland had never seen a daylight gang ambush like this. Military-style weapons, disguises, tactical, planning. It looked like terrorism, not criminal retaliation. Authorities immediately suspected only one organization had the motive, the Hutch gang. They already believed Jerry Hutch survived an attempted assassination weeks earlier. Now the response had arrived. In public, with cameras rolling, in broad daylight. Ireland had just entered a new era of organized crime, and something even more terrifying. The Kinahans didn't retreat. They didn't hide. They prepared revenge, because in their world, there is no turn the other cheek. There is no diplomacy. There is only retaliation. Within days, Daniel Kinahan began planning an execution list. Family members of the Hutch clan, associates, friends, anyone connected. Daniel didn't want negotiation. He wanted elimination, and from that moment forward, Dublin became a battlefield. Over the next 3 years, at least 18 people were killed, many murdered in cold blood, some at home, some on the street, some because they were simply related to someone on Daniel's list. 2 victims weren't even connected to the feud. They were killed simply due to mistaken identity. This wasn't rivalry anymore. This was extermination. And as the bodies increased, as funerals multiplied, something else grew even more powerful. The Kinahan Empire. Because every act of violence didn't weaken them, it made them stronger. Their message was simple: if you cross us, there will be a price. After the Regency Hotel attack, the international reputation of the Kinahan Group shifted dramatically as investigators realized that the organization was no longer a shadowy drug network operating mostly behind the scenes. It had become the most visible criminal empire in the history of Ireland, bold enough to openly wage war with another syndicate in crowded public venues. From that moment, intelligence analysts across Europe began tracking where the group was relocating its major decision makers, and almost every trail led to Spain, Morocco, and eventually the Middle East. Daniel Kinahan, already known for moving large cocaine shipments into Ireland, started diversifying the organization's revenue streams, using Spain as a staging ground, while maintaining a loyal circle of Irish associates who acted as enforcers. Many crime journalists noted that although Daniel grew up in the shadow of his father's empire, the son eventually surpassed his father in scale, ambition, and international networking. One of the most revealing developments following the feud was Daniel's growing involvement in professional combat sports. Boxing promoters working in Ireland, the UK, and Spain later admitted that fights, sponsorships, and management deals became a convenient gateway for the Kinahan network to launder money under the appearance of legitimate business. The founding of MTK Global, a combat sports management company created with Irish boxer Matthew Macklin, allowed Daniel to move between professional athletes, managers, promoters, and wealthy figures who were often unaware or pretended to be unaware of his background. Large international fights could move millions of euros at a time, and investigators believed the sport became the perfect disguise for transactions that would otherwise draw suspicion. What made this development particularly alarming for law enforcement was the level of acceptance Daniel received in elite boxing circles, even appearing as an advisor in negotiations connected to world championship bouts. Meanwhile, the feud inside Ireland intensified long after the Regency shooting. Retaliatory attacks continued in Dublin, Spain, and even in prison facilities, as members loyal to each side targeted family members, cousins, and close associates. Ordinary citizens began living under a sense of permanent threat, because many of the murders were carried out in busy public neighborhoods in broad daylight. At times, victims were completely innocent individuals, mistakenly identified as targets because they resembled someone connected to the Hutch side. The scale of violence shocked even veteran police officers who compared the conflict to a private civil war happening inside Irish society. Some members of the Hutch group attempted to leave Ireland altogether, while others were said to move constantly from safe house to safe house because no police protection program could cancel the Kinahan organization's reach. The most disturbing consequence of the feud was the normalization of professional hitmen, many hired from outside Ireland. Spanish, Lithuanian, and Eastern European gunmen were increasingly used for targeted killings, proving that the Kinahan group had transitioned from a national threat into a European-level cartel. The Hutch organization, while dangerous, did not possess the same financial muscle to hire international assassins at the scale Kinahan could. As bodies continued to appear, the feud became a priority, not only for the Irish police, but also for Europol and British authorities, because many of the murders were planned from Spain or carried out across borders. The situation was so extreme that intelligence reports described the Kinahan organization as the Irish equivalent of a transnational mafia syndicate. In other words, Ireland suddenly realized it was facing a criminal empire closer to the model of Italian or Latin American cartels, rather than a traditional gang. During these years, Daniel and his father officially relocated to Dubai, a country that many international crime figures have used as a safe zone due to business-friendly laws and the absence of direct extradition agreements with certain European countries. The Kinahans established multiple companies registered under the names of associates, handling export-import operations, food, textiles, and various forms of consultancy. Investigative journalists found that several of these businesses were only paper fronts designed to launder money from drug trafficking, particularly cocaine routed from South America to Europe. Dubai's luxurious private communities, private security, and international financial system gave the Kinahan leadership the perfect environment to live openly while hiding operational decisions behind layers of shell companies. Even more concerning, reports indicated that the Kinahans developed relationships with officials and wealthy individuals connected to the region, gaining both protection and access to banking channels that were previously unavailable to Irish police. Meanwhile, inside Ireland, the criminal landscape continued to evolve. Young dealers, inspired by the brutal rise of the Kinahan Cartel, began imitating the model on a smaller scale, using encrypted technology, burner phones, and international suppliers. But none of these groups possessed the multi-million euro supply chain controlled by Daniel. Analysts estimated that at its peak, the Kinahan network supplied the majority of heroin and cocaine entering both Ireland and the UK, and later developed a presence in mainland Europe. Rumours circulated that the cartel was worth hundreds of millions, possibly close to €1 billion, although no official number could ever be confirmed. One major reason was that the organisation never kept wealth inside Ireland, where it could be seized more easily. Instead, profits moved constantly between Spain, Dubai, the Netherlands, Latin America, and offshore accounts connected to complex corporate structures. Law enforcement in Ireland eventually realised that traditional police operations would never stop a network that operated internationally, and Europol involvement became crucial. The Hutch organisation slowly weakened under constant attacks, and although occasional retaliatory shootings continued, the feud ultimately destroyed dozens of lives and destabilised the Irish underworld for years. By the late 2010s, the Kinahan organisation was no longer simply a national drug cartel. It had matured into a global criminal enterprise with influence in finance, sports, logistics, and transnational trafficking routes. What began with a small-time fraudster in Dublin had evolved into one of the most dangerous European crime families of the modern era. As European authorities tightened surveillance on cocaine trafficking routes during the late 2010s, something unusual began appearing in intelligence reports. References linking the Kinahan organization to Middle Eastern financial channels and intermediaries believed to be connected to money laundering pipelines stretching from Europe to the Gulf states. Investigators were surprised to find that while most major drug cartels relied on Latin American or African laundering hubs, the Kinahans were now using Dubai, Bahrain, and occasionally Turkey as operational bases. Several European police forces began openly stating that the group was behaving less like a European crime family and more like a multinational corporation with headquarters in a tax-friendly financial zone. At the same time, the family's public image continued to shift because Daniel was becoming more visible in global boxing circles. although the company known as MTK Global insisted Daniel was no longer in control. Fighters, promoters, and sports media frequently mentioned his influence in negotiations. For law enforcement, this created an unusual situation. Criminals who once avoided cameras were now appearing in friendly photographs with world champion athletes, broadcasters, and high-profile businessmen. From the viewpoint of police investigators, the Kinahan family's greatest strength was not violence, although they had certainly demonstrated a willingness to kill anyone who opposed them, but rather their ability to adapt faster than authorities could respond. When Dublin became too dangerous, they shifted to Spain. When Spain increased pressure, they moved to Dubai. When Europe strengthened financial scrutiny, they redirected business through private companies in the Gulf. Journalists who studied the group described Christopher Kinahan Sr. as a strategist who always kept a second plan, a third plan, and sometimes even a fourth. Unlike other gang leaders who built their reputations on intimidation, Christopher built his empire by studying languages, forming alliances, and learning how international trade systems worked. By the late 2010s, he was reportedly fluent in multiple languages and frequently used trusted messengers, encrypted devices, and intermediaries to make it nearly impossible to trace orders directly to him. Another major transformation occurred when law enforcement started linking the Kinahan group with Hezbollah and other Middle Eastern criminal financial networks. According to US briefings, certain factions within Hezbollah had developed a sophisticated revenue stream based on facilitating international drug shipments and laundering the proceeds through global banking channels. While no single investigation fully proved the Kinahan-Hezbollah connection, the possibility alone was enough to elevate the Kinahans into the highest threat category within transnational organized crime. In April 2022, the US Department of State took an unprecedented step by announcing multi-million-dollar rewards for information leading to the capture or conviction of Daniel Christopher Jr. and their father. This move was normally reserved for terrorist organizations or global drug cartels, putting the Irish family in the same international category as Latin American kingpins. Meanwhile, inside Ireland, ordinary communities increasingly viewed the Kinahan name with a mixture of dread and fascination. Families devastated by drug addiction blamed the organization for generations of suffering, while younger criminals saw Daniel as an example of how far a person could rise from Dublin's housing estates. Politicians struggled to respond because the group's operations rarely took place on Irish soil anymore. While the Hutch feud caused dozens of deaths locally, the true operations, shipping, money filtering, weapons procurement, were happening thousands of kilometers away in places where Irish police held almost no authority. For a long time, this gave the Kinahans a sense of untouchability. They could live in luxurious Dubai residences, employ private security, and conduct business across continents, while Irish courts were powerless to act without international cooperation. What changed that balance was international media exposure and pressure from the United States. Investigative journalists discovered the names of companies registered to the Kinahans in the UAE, and exposed evidence suggesting that certain local authorities had permitted them to operate businesses despite knowing their global criminal reputation. Under growing international pressure, the UAE eventually froze Kinahan assets and began cooperating with Irish and American requests. Around the same period, other cartel figures linked to the Kinahans were arrested in Europe, including high-ranking lieutenants responsible for logistics and transportation. These arrests did not destroy the family, but they disrupted operations and forced Daniel to depend more heavily on trusted inner circle members. For the first time since the group's rise in the 1990s, international law enforcement believed the Kinahans were vulnerable. The arrests of major figures connected to freight companies and encrypted communications revealed cracks in the organization that previously seemed impossible. Even the boxing world began distancing itself after the US sanctions were announced, with promoters and fighters publicly denying continued ties to Daniel. The once glamorous business connections that shielded his reputation slowly turned into liabilities. Suddenly, appearing in photos with Daniel was no longer an exciting association. It was a career-ending risk. Still, the organization remained active. Investigators believed cocaine shipments continued through southern Europe, with profits routed into shell corporations in Asia and the Middle East. But the confident international swagger began fading as more governments recognized the Kinahans as a priority threat. By 2024, Ireland signed an extradition treaty with the UAE, a step that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier. The arrest of key Kinahan figure Sean McGovern in Dubai signaled the beginning of a new phase. For the first time, the leaders of the Kinahan Cartel could no longer depend entirely on foreign jurisdictions to protect them from Irish law. Pressure intensified as each arrest produced new intelligence, new testimonies, and new digital records. Investigators became convinced that the Kinahan empire, despite still being wealthy and dangerous, was facing a gradual but steady collapse. Yet even while authorities considered filing major charges, analysts warned that powerful criminal organizations rarely disappear. Overnight, the Kinahan Group still retained financial resources, loyal members, and global relationships cultivated over decades. The collapse of a cartel is often slow, unpredictable, and sometimes violent, and while the original empire may weaken, splinter groups often emerge, creating new networks and new criminal dynasties. For Ireland, the tragic legacy of the Kinahan organization may continue long after the founders themselves are arrested or gone, as younger generations attempt to replicate the formula that turned one Dublin family into one of the most feared international criminal enterprises of the 21st century. As the Kinahan organization moved deeper into the 2020s, the world around them had changed dramatically, and for the first time in nearly 4 decades, their criminal empire finally began to feel real pressure from several major governments at once. Law enforcement in Ireland had always viewed the Kinahans as almost untouchable, but once international agencies like the DEA, the FBI, and Europol linked the group's drug trafficking routes to several terror-connected financial networks, the United States placed the organization directly under its foreign narcotics sanctions program, effectively turning Daniel and Christopher into internationally wanted fugitives. When the US Treasury announced sanctions against them, it marked a turning point that many senior investigators had been waiting for since the 1990s, because for the very first time, the cartel could no longer move money through regular banking systems, register businesses under normal corporate structures, or fly internationally without exposing themselves to potential arrest. The move also made it illegal for financial institutions across Europe and America to process any transactions connected to the Kinahan family, freezing their assets and shutting down the international luxury lifestyle they had become so famously proud of. For years, Dubai was believed to be a safe haven for crime figures, a place where wealthy criminal organizations could live quietly without extradition agreements and without serious questions from authorities. The Kinahans built companies in food distribution, sports marketing, and clothing import businesses, using them to disguise millions in narco money that was flowing from Irish and British ports all the way through Spain, the Netherlands, Colombia, and Morocco. But international pressure finally forced the UAE to cooperate, and by 2022, the Kinahan headquarters in Dubai was no longer invisible. Even high-ranking UAE officials admitted privately that the trio had become a diplomatic headache, and for the first time, talk of extradition began to feel not only possible, but inevitable. Irish security sources confirmed that UAE authorities privately froze accounts belonging to Daniel and Christopher, and by early 2024, the power that once seemed untouchable now looked increasingly fragile. Investigators today say that Daniel lives in near isolation inside a highly secured residence in Dubai, moving rarely and speaking only through encrypted communication systems. Several of his closest associates have already been arrested or forced into hiding. It is believed that he communicates with what remains of the organization only through trusted intermediaries, and every month that passes makes it harder for him to maintain direct control. Christopher Jr. remains in Dubai as well, although intelligence analysts believe he plays a smaller operational role compared to Daniel's historically ruthless position as the enforcer and strategic commander of narcotic supply lines. Their father, the original mastermind, is now older, tired, and operating from the shadows, reportedly in poor health and no longer capable of personally directing international trafficking operations, even though his name still terrifies long-time rivals across Ireland. Because of new legal pressure and rapidly evolving police tactics, several major Irish crime groups have begun replacing the Kinahan monopoly. The family, another powerful criminal organisation mostly based in Dublin's inner-city districts, has already taken control of cocaine and heroin routes, once entirely controlled by Daniel. Without the constant threat of Kinahan retaliation, smaller organised groups have started working more aggressively, expanding into counties previously dominated by Kinahan local networks. For the first time since the 1990s, Irish narcotics markets are no longer dominated by a single empire, which directly weakens Daniel's influence and makes the organisation appear less permanent and less terrifying than before. However, even with these setbacks, Irish authorities repeatedly warn that the Kinahans remain one of the most dangerous criminal organisations in modern European history. Their global cocaine connections, especially in South America, were built over decades, and dismantling those networks fully could take another decade. But the biggest concern for international investigators is not simply drug trafficking. It is the cartel's confirmed links with Middle Eastern armed groups, violent criminal brokers in Turkey, and money laundering organizations connected to Hezbollah. In 2024, several intelligence releases stated clearly that the organization used narcotics money to build a global laundering network involving multiple crypto pipelines, real estate investments across the Middle East, and offshore corporate ownership schemes that moved money through several jurisdictions simultaneously. Investigators say this structure was deliberately designed so that even if Daniel is arrested, the financial machine could continue operating somewhere in the shadows. Today, several extradition attempts are in progress. UAE officials have quietly indicated that they will not protect internationally wanted drug bosses, and lawyers from at least 3 countries have already begun preparing legal documents. It is believed that if Dubai officially approves extradition, Daniel could face charges not just in Ireland, but in the United States, where narcotics trafficking linked to terrorism carries the possibility of life imprisonment. Irish prosecutors are also preparing a list of murder-related charges, including directing criminal organisations responsible for multiple killings during the Hutch-Kinahan feud. In total, dozens of murders could be legally connected to Daniel's leadership decisions. Most analysts agree, if Daniel is extradited, the entire organisation could collapse within months. But others warn that criminal empires rarely vanish, they fragment. Without a single leader, the organisation may split into several violent factions, each controlled by ambitious younger lieutenants trying to claim what remains of the empire. Historically, every major collapse of an Irish crime cartel has been followed by violent restructuring and chaotic power struggles, which means the downfall of the Kinahan family may actually trigger another wave of violence both in Ireland and overseas. Despite all this pressure, the Kinahan name remains powerful inside narcotics networks worldwide. Old-school cartel families in Spain, Morocco, Colombia and Turkey still consider Daniel a major international broker. Even without direct control, the family's legacy continues to influence how cocaine moves into European markets. Their involvement in professional boxing created an image of legitimacy that helped them launder millions for more than a decade. And although companies have distanced themselves, the impact remains visible. Investigative reporters believe that even if the Kinahans are finally arrested, the shadow of their empire may continue shaping organized crime across Ireland for another generation. By early 2025, law enforcement agencies across Europe agreed that the era of the Kinahan Cartel as an untouchable criminal superpower was finally coming to an end, but very few experts were willing to say that the threat was over. Europol analysts openly described the organization as one of the most resilient criminal networks ever produced on European soil, a group that did not rise suddenly and therefore would not collapse suddenly either. Decades of strategic networking, international routes, financial channels, and violent influence had embedded the Kinahans into the global drug economy in a way that could not be erased by a single arrest. Yet the signs of weakening were clear. The group that once stood above all other Irish criminal enterprises was now fragmented, hunted, and slowly losing operational territory to newer syndicates that had learned from the Kinahan playbook. Inside Ireland, there was a quiet shift in the criminal landscape. The younger generation that once idolized Daniel now viewed him less as a symbol of success and more as a warning of what happens when international crime grows too visible. The Hutch feud had left too many bodies, too much public fear, and too much political pressure for any young Irish trafficker to repeat it openly. Community organisations across Dublin's most drug-ravaged neighbourhoods began documenting how the Kinahan organisation's rise brought unprecedented levels of homicide, addiction and gun culture into areas already suffering from poverty and unemployment. Families broken by addiction did not view the Kinahans as clever businessmen or powerful crime bosses. They viewed them as the architects of death in communities already fighting for survival. However, outside Ireland, the Kinahan legacy looks different. Internationally, the organisation is remembered within cartel networks as one of the few European crime families to successfully control a major cocaine corridor, rivaling groups that traditionally operated in Spain, Italy and the Balkans. In Spain, police still discuss Operation Shovel as one of the largest failed attempts to dismantle a cartel. In the Netherlands, criminal researchers point out that the Kinahans were among the first Irish criminal groups to build credible relationships with South American suppliers. In the United Kingdom, multiple police forces continue tracking money laundering routes connected to companies that operated under Kinahan-influenced networks for nearly 20 years. In America, federal agencies will remember them as a European cartel linked directly or indirectly to global terror finance. The final question that remains unanswered is whether Daniel himself will ever return to Ireland. For Irish authorities, extradition would represent the symbolic end of a criminal empire that humiliated the nation's justice system for decades. But even if Daniel is placed in front of an Irish court, there remains a significant legal challenge, proving his direct command over crimes that were carried out indirectly through dozens of trusted lieutenants and international associates. Prosecutors admit that the Kinahans learned from past criminal dynasties by avoiding fingerprints, avoiding direct meetings, and ensuring that every major order passed through multiple encrypted layers. Even when Irish law enforcement intercepted messages or recovered devices, they rarely found Daniel speaking directly. His leadership existed in suggestion, instruction, and reputation rather than in the simple language of written orders. For international investigators, the real importance of Daniel's arrest would not be legal, it would be psychological. Many younger gang members across Ireland formed their ambitions around the legend of a Dublin criminal who moved to Spain, built a global empire, and became a billionaire supplier of cocaine. If Daniel disappears into a prison cell, the mythology collapses. Ambitious young criminals would no longer see the Kinahan rise as destiny, but as a temporary illusion that eventually ends in chains. But at the same time, history shows that the fall of one criminal dynasty almost always produces the rise of another. The collapse of the Dunn organization created the space for Christopher Kinahan to take control of Dublin's heroin supply. The weakening of the Hutch network helped Daniel consolidate territory. Now, with Daniel fading and the family scattered, new criminal entrepreneurs are already moving to fill the vacuum. The crime group known as The Family has already overtaken Kinahan control of Dublin's most profitable cocaine routes. New suppliers in Turkey and Morocco are actively building Irish distribution partnerships. Even encrypted communication services have evolved to a point where young dealers operate internationally without ever meeting their suppliers in person. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Kinahan story is that it did not begin with poverty, trauma, or the usual roots of organized crime. Christopher Kinahan was not abused, neglected, or raised in the slums. He came from a comfortable middle-class home, fluent in languages, unusually intelligent, and drawn not by desperation, but by ambition. He committed fraud not because he needed survival money, but because he believed he deserved more than the ordinary life handed to him. He built a cartel not because he was forced into the criminal world, but because he chose it. For some investigators, this makes the Kinahan rise more dangerous than any cartel that emerged from poverty. It proves that organized crime will always attract ambitious minds, not just desperate ones. As of early 2025, the Kinahan organization exists in a kind of suspended state, still wealthy, still dangerous, but increasingly trapped and shrinking under extreme international pressure. Their public image lies in ruins, their financial assets are frozen, their ability to move freely is almost gone, and their future looks less like the story of a dynasty that will continue forever, and more like a crime empire at the final stage of its lifespan. The collapse might take years, arrests might come slowly, but the era is ending. Still, one reality remains uncomfortable and true. Even after Daniel and his father are gone, Ireland will continue living in the aftermath of everything they created. The children growing up in drug-ravaged communities, the families destroyed by addiction, and the criminal networks they inspired will remain long after the Kinahan name disappears from newspapers. Perhaps the darkest legacy of the Kinahans is not the bodies buried or the drugs imported. It is the idea they planted in the minds of a generation that organized crime is a path to power, wealth, and international respect. Time will reveal whether future generations reject that fantasy or attempt to repeat it.